Hey folks, we have a great interview for you today. I'm joined now by Michael Brooks of The Michael Brooks Show. You may also recognize him from The Majority Report with Sam Cedar. Michael, welcome to the show.
Hey David, great to be with you, man. Really
Great to,
appreciate it.
great to have you on. So before we'll be talking a bit about Brazil and the IDW, but before we get there, I actually want to know more about your background. So I know you lived abroad for a while. Tell us about your experience doing that and the kind of perspective that it gave you.
Well, I studied abroad in Turkey, and I've spent a little bit of time in other places in the Middle East and the Caribbean and Europe. But I mean, it was really just a kind of extended junior year, abroad. I guess going to Ankara in Turkey was a little bit of a different flavor than, going to Italy or something. It was a really interesting time. I was there, I think, in 2007 to 2008, maybe 2007. I actually don't have the precise dates. It was a very it was a very hectic time. I was there with a college girlfriend. We were in a very high velocity, high drama thing. So that was one element of it. The element that's more relevant, I guess, for people to understand was I was really interested, and it seems, it's kind of tragic in a way, although I have to say it wasn't terribly surprising. But there was the idea at the time that Erdogan and the AKP, Justice and Development Party, they really had branded themselves as kind of like a Muslim party that was doing 21st century democratic politics. And, my politics were, I was always somewhere on the left. I think in college, in some ways, probably sort of because I was a total Noam Chomsky sort of teenager and World Bank protester. I think I kind of burned out on that a little bit, and I was very interested in questions of how do we practice democracy? How do we establish human rights? What are human rights? With people drawing from different sources. So I was really interested in these kind of global questions, and the perception was that the AKP and Erdogan at that time was sort of synthesizing these things. Now, when I was in Turkey, I would say there was plenty of topics, like even like the Armenian genocide, which you really cannot talk about there. Like that isn't a joke. Where, frankly, the communist students were the only people who had any sort of recognizable politics. But, so there's a lot of conversations about what was happening in Turkey. And I think the Marxists were right that it was, in some ways, it was kind of one sector of the sort of business class supplanting another. Also a lot of talk about Venezuela, and, Obama was running for president. So that was the kind of political part of it. But there was, I hitchhiked around, and I actually we spent definitely some time in some of the areas now that are really affected by the war in Syria. And so I think, it definitely affected my perspective. But I've always had a pretty strong impulse. Like I grew up in a totally broke family. I wasn't traveling overseas. I don't have any like family that were, involved in diplomacy or anything. But for whatever reason, I was always really interested in in how other people are kind of metabolizing the world and how they're sort of thinking about things. And, and in some ways it's not like some of the kind of like lame multicultural discourse now is very, it's very reductive, because it doesn't necessarily mean like it's a positive thing, right? Like every place has its own incredible problems and contradictions, just like we do. But you want to have a sense, I think, of like the texture of other places, and I did get that studying in Turkey. Yeah.
So,
made a lot of Borat jokes too.
Sorry, say that.
I made a lot of Borat jokes too.
Oh yeah, of course. So, when did you begin to really I guess, educate yourself on Brazil, because you've discussed a lot about Lula da Silva, the former president of Brazil, and how he's a political prisoner, and how it could have sort of implications or at least lessons to be learned from that situation. But where did you begin your education with on what's happening in Brazil, and why do you see what's happening there as why is it so important? Do you think?
Well, where it began, I mean, look, I did go on and, I did go to college and study international relations, which probably in political theory, which does help. But I was also, I was a very autodidactic and very experience driven, kid. So I think I probably first became aware of Lula, like, you know, I I think, and I could be wrong, but I think like reading a New York Times article about him when I was a teenager, when he was first cutting towards or getting elected to the presidency of Brazil, and even then it was like, this is an interesting person. I mean,
Hmm.
this is not the prototype of who gets elected president or prime minister in most places,
Yeah.
someone who grew up in extreme poverty, someone who lost a finger as a metal worker, and rose up through labor unions. So you had that one element, but then in other ways, kind of like some of the guys that I was interested in South Africa, it was also like, oh, okay, there's all of this sort of like different background, but he's also like clearly a strategic genius and is like an incredibly skilled politician. I guess those are probably still the two poles of things that I respect and gravitate to. Like if you have like a strong, profound commitment to addressing things like, inequality, that is very core to me. And I think, people who just want to play politics as a game and that's all they're into, I mean, they suck and they're mostly actually bad at it and really boring people.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, I think, I do think there are, things like strategy or whatever are not all bullshit, even though
Hmm.
a lot of people talk about it, are usually full of shit. But in
Yeah.
this case, you had a guy who really did, have this incredible synthesis of like this huge amount of charisma and common touch, but was clearly also like outwitting all of these like traditional hyper elites who are trained with every pore of their being to look down on somebody like that, right?
Yeah.
And it was also part of the time where, even though again I would say like my politics sort of moved in and out of things, they were never like, there was always a pretty strong camp in the left. And so, Latin America during that period of time was like the place. If you were interested in governments trying to deliver things for people or fight US interference, right? The pink tide. And there was a lot of different flavors. There was big things obviously happening in Venezuela, but also like Bolivia and Ecuador and in Argentina, and Lula was a main figure in that.
Hmm.
So more recently, the way this is played out, and there's a lot of history to it, but in his successor Dilma Rousseff, who in some, I have to say, like, she kind of, I mean, I guess, yes, on some level, just objectively, she doesn't have the same sort of status as Lula, but she's also like this incredibly fascinating figure who, was a guerrilla fighter,
Hmm.
and rose to the presidency. And I think, I wish she had not done some of the things she did with the economy, which I don't think Lula would have done, just frankly, again, just strategically.
Hmm.
But I think she's also like an incredibly admirable person, and she faced like a huge onslaught of everything in her presidency. And, starting from like, I think just genuine campaigns of destabilization and obviously a lot of misogyny.
Yeah.
But what happened was in, you know, I'll try to make this as concise as possible, but I think that the big story is, I mean, one, she was impeached, and she was literally impeached on an accounting, like basically saying like one piece of money was in, like money that was there was, but it was like in a different budget than it was in, right? Like, I mean, a very basic accounting trick,
Yeah.
which people, politicians do the world over, and they certainly do in Brazil. I mean, Brazil is a country where like you have people like facing like credible murder and like cartel charges who might serve in politics, right? And like
Hmm.
serious. So she was impeached in a totally politicized, ludicrous way. And then you saw this kind of heat coming at Lula, and I already registered it. Like I did speak out against it a little bit at the time. Now, I had, even in 2015, 16, like I was, I had a role in the Majority Report. I was kind of building myself out. I didn't have anywhere near the sort of platform that I guess I have now. And in my view, I still have a hell of a lot to work on and do. So in my defense, it wasn't like I had a show where I could, dedicate a huge amount of time to that story. But
Hmm.
I think also, though, and what I want people to be really wary about was that, I was still kind of like absorbing some of these kind of like puritanical left wing critiques of what was happening in Brazil. And even though I opposed it, I did kind of understand what was going on. I took too much of the corruption talk at face value.
Hmm.
And when I really started to investigate it, because there was this huge corruption investigation called Lava Jato, right? And
Yeah.
the car wash investigation. And this is every time you read a report, they'll say that Lula isn't, because he eventually was sent to prison in a way that, and this is when I really started strongly covering it because it was extraordinary. I mean, he was leading in the polls for the presidency, and he was put in jail literally based off of witness testimony and for something that the prosecutor called indeterminate acts. The prosecutor is also the judge, which is another incredible, like, it's literally a piece of Brazilian law that goes back to the Inquisition that they haven't changed. So this
Wow.
very, very politically motivated, vindictive prosecutor put Lula in jail while he was leading in the polls. And then the court silenced him during the election. He wouldn't let him do interviews. He released a couple of letters. So it just became really clear, like, on one level, okay, this is bullshit, and also this is really dangerous. And I do see a U.S. hand in this because the DOJ cooperated very significantly with Lava Jato, and I do think even though Lula did his best to, establish and work cooperatively, really with everybody. I mean, literally from like Ahmadinejad to Bush.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, the Workers' Party were not willing to privatize core strategic assets in like the oil sector as an example. So I do think that that's a part of this story. So
Yeah.
you have a guy who lifted about 35 million people from poverty,
Wow.
maybe more. So by my types of measures that I consider to be the most important thing, and the historian Perry Anderson said he's the most successful president of the 21st century.
Yeah.
So you have all of that going on, and then the second thing, and I'll try to tighten it, but it really started to hit me that like generic anti-corruption discourse, which is so easy for people to lock onto because it's, I mean, one, because it's like, sure, everybody doesn't like corruption, right? We all get that corruption is bad, but we don't think critically about what that actually means when people are discoursing it. And what we're seeing in the modern rise of global far-right populism is that it is these fascists or far-right populists who leverage that rhetoric and win. I mean,
Yeah.
people forget, and it was comical because, I mean, Donald Trump is Donald Trump. But whatever. He said, drain the swamp. He made a lot of hay. I mean, even down to talking. I mean, this guy who called Haiti a shithole country called out the Clintons' conduct in Haiti. And by the
Yeah.
way, the Clintons' conduct in Haiti is pretty obscene. That's like a real story.
Hmm.
So, Orban used this. Narendra Modi used this to rise in India, and Jair Bolsonaro, the fascist that governs Brazil, talked about this ad nauseum. So it was like, wait a second. First of all, what is corruption, right? Because
Yeah.
on one level, to me, capitalism is corruption, right? Like the mass misallocation of
Hmm.
resources is corruption. And then there's like, to the extent that you ever documented, I mean, first of all, the case they have against Lula, which again is only based on testimony, is mind-blowingly minimal. It's literally like renovations on an apartment. I mean, it's actually like the amount of resources that have been put into destroying this guy and the way that it's uncritically repeated in the New York Times and the Guardian and the
Yeah.
BBC. It's like, I guess I'll lay it on the line that I would still support and defend Lula even if there was like a real case
Hmm.
that involving something so minimal. And I think I've been really transparent about it.
Yeah.
But the other thing that was going on in Brazil was like the United States. I mean, there's a very unregulated finance system for campaigns.
Hmm.
Unlike the United States, there's dozens of little parties, and these are like not in a positive sense of having more options. They're literally like mini fiefdoms of like it's like you and I get together. We're like, hey, all right, we're gonna start the fucking new YouTube democracy party.
Yeah.
We'll get these 2 seats and we'll sit and we will take bribes to vote an agenda. The first serious scandal that hit Lula's government, and I think it did reveal, some problems and so on, but the bottom line of the first scandal was literally the Workers' Party paying off smaller parties to vote for things like minimum wage increases, labor union protection, things like that.
Yeah.
So to me, it's like we need to really complicate what the conversation about corruption is, both because, of course, in the United States, the same people who will be total moralists and have no nuance or sophistication when they talk about a country like Brazil, but then will like bend over backwards for like actual just corrosive nothing politicians like Joe Biden. That's
Yeah.
one thing. But even more importantly, because even frankly, I think I'm somebody who did say, yeah, I loathe Hillary Clinton. But I mean, we've already been through this a million times, and it's boring. But like that was the right choice over Donald Trump. And
Yeah.
part of understanding what the right choice is being able to disaggregate these things. Now, in Lula's case, I mean, it's a lot easier because okay, nobody's perfect, but here's a guy again who lifted tens of millions of people out of poverty
Hmm.
and even today, I mean, they're starting to allow him to speak, and he's giving these cogent, smart, on top of it interviews about how to defeat these forces. I mean, this is still one of like the best political minds that we have. So,
Yeah.
I think it's important for him. I think it's important because Brazil is the largest country in Latin America, and I think it's important because the United States constantly interferes. And I also think it's really important because, the last thing I'll say, the institutions are different in the United States. The way it would work would be different. But if you don't think that, like, I mean, if Bernie Sanders gets elected president, and you already see it in the press coverage of everything, there is going to be the most relentless
Yeah.
campaigns of bullshit imaginable. And that is an extreme case. I don't think we're in a place institutionally where they could like put Bernie in jail.
Okay.
But I do think I'm not saying that, but I do think people really need to learn from how these institutions respond because I think in other ways it's not necessarily as dissimilar as people might think. I mean, even look at some of the things Corbyn is facing.
Yeah. So there's one more layer to that. The prosecution of Lula I want to bring up are there connections to Bolsonaro? Like, isn't the judge part of the Bolsonaro's cabinet now? Is that true?
So Sergio Moro, who's the prosecutor, first of all, his nickname for Lula was Nine because Lula's missing a finger, and his
Oh.
goal is to get him 9 years in prison. I mean, this is another like very vindictive, really right wing connected, disgusting figure who was uncritically praised. Yes, Bolsonaro made him justice minister, and so that was that's his gig. He's been looking into, I remember when they first got into office, he was talking about having to look into labor unions, period. So it's part and continuing to go after other members of the Workers' Party. Today, as we record this in Brazil, there's huge mass demonstrations against Bolsonaro's plans to basically eliminate philosophy and sociology departments in universities. And
Wow.
already all of the mass cuts they're doing in all parts of education, from like science and R&D, but also obviously like the humanities and social sciences. So there is a huge pushback. But I mean, Sergio Moro is a great example of that because, even like that was something that even a lot of progressive channels, and I won't get into names because I really don't want this to turn into some silly side beef. You can watch my videos if you want to, but
Yeah.
it's like they did. It was like, oh yeah, like this is so great. There's this prosecutor in Brazil who's taking on the political establishment, and it's like, okay, but what this has actually led to is literally the election of a neo-fascist president in the literal usage of that term. Was an army captain when Brazil was run by a military dictatorship that term was coined for.
Yeah.
Who's attacking the indigenous people, who's working to privatize pensions, who is, in addition to all of the LGBTQ atrocities, in addition to like he wants farmers to basically just have like carte blanche to shoot people who go on their land. And even before he came into power, after the impeachment, under Lula and Dilma, Brazil was taken off of the hunger map. It was put back on under Temer. So that's been the big takeaway, is like it's an assault on working people, and it's an imprisonment of, a really good leader. And,
Yeah.
everybody was so fixated on this simplistic anti-corruption discourse, they missed the broader dynamics.
So this may be a question with no easy answer, but can the left actually win if we don't play as dirty as the right? And I don't mean in the sense that, put somebody in jail on trumped up charges, but there has to be. Do you think that the left needs to be a little more tough? I guess. Like, what is your position on how the left should actually respond to these far right politicians?
I think the left actually needs to be way more tolerant and healthy internally, and way more vicious and ruthless externally.
Mm.
So I think like internal debate is great, but I think that, there are some super toxic subcultures that have developed on the left, and I think that you really need to think about how to build like a resilient, sophisticated, forgiving at times, like a much more cohesive internal culture. Because I think, that was even a small piece of what happened in Brazil, right? Like one of the other elements of the story was that in 2013, there were these anti-bus, fare increase protests targeting a Workers' Party mayor. And like, okay, that's great. I would probably be at those demos.
Hmm.
But that energy got turned and filtered into these sprawling anti-government protests. It wasn't leveraged strategically. It ended up, again, being another thing that facilitated the right. So
Yeah.
I think that there actually needs to be work in that regard internally. And then, yeah, I think, I don't know what that looks like, because again, what's tricky is I feel like, the people who branded themselves, particularly in U.S. politics, is like the people like, that was the Clintons' whole thing. Like, hey, even if you disagree with all of these things that we do and all of our policy sets, we know how to beat these people.
Yeah.
No, you don't. So, I don't know. I mean, I think my sense is like Bernie seems like he's not fucking around in this race. Like
Yeah.
he's pretty on it. Like I have to say, like I like when I listen to, Clinton people whine about Bernie, like it blows my mind, because if I ran Bernie's campaign in 2016, I would go after Hillary Clinton for stuff, even stuff that I don't think is that important.
Yeah, I mean, you see
And they were,
Obama back in '07, and he was going hard against Clinton. Like, you see how Obama ran against Clinton in '07. Bernie didn't do anywhere near that in 2016. So, yeah, I completely agree with
not at all.
Bernie needing to be a little tougher this time around. But
Yeah, it needs to be really tough, and I think, yeah, and I do think an advantage you have when you are putting forth policies that benefit people is, I do think that, look, that doesn't take care of itself. Politics is still politics, and you still have to go out there and do your thing for sure. But I do think it's helpful, like when, because I mean that was the really funny thing is when you have like a generation of just like total moral cretins with no vision, like Rahm Emanuel, and it's like, all of this stuff like, oh yeah, he fucking sent a pollster a dead fish and like all this stuff, and it's like, why did he do that? Oh, to get like a tax rebate for people making like 50 grand in
Yeah.
like a state for 1 year for like some type of like dystopian dull as hell best case scenario might minimally help neoliberal, boring bullshit policy. So,
Yeah.
I think, yeah.
Let's turn to the intellectual dark web now, because you have a book coming out in the summer, I
Yeah.
believe. Is there a name for it yet?
There isn't a name for it yet. It's going to be in the summer or the fall. I'm like, it's getting a lot closer, and then I feel like the name will reveal itself. That's like the hardest part.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
So,
Have you written a book?
sorry?
Have you written a book?
Oh no,
Oh,
I'm not sure if anywhere near writing a book, but just in terms of like titling like videos, I
oh
understand
yeah,
what you're
sure,
talking about in
sure,
terms of
sure.
that sense. But
Yeah.
yeah. So, what have you learned uh, in all your work on researching the IDW? I guess what have you taken away from this weird, awkward movement that really isn't about anything that's different or new, isn't really about helping people? I mean, what is sort of your overall perspective on the IDW?
Well, this is really tricky. I mean, because there's some bigger takeaways, which I think, which are going to be the kind of like core of the book in a way, and almost I think if I do my job well, they'll at least be an interesting option more generally for how to approach left-wing politics. Um, One of the things that's tricky is like, you know, yeah, there is a part of me that's like, I mean, come on, like we haven't moved past this shit.
Yeah,
So, but I've had to subordinate that a little bit because I realize like I do. For the first part is like, look, and I think Amber Frost made this point really well. Like, you can't moralize one way or another. Like, I know, like they're like, and I get the tendency. I understand, like, oh wow, like whiny, young white males, blah blah blah. But the truth of the matter is like, even take it without any empathy or compassion. That's a pretty dangerous demographic.
yeah,
You might want to fucking think about them and actually try to strategize because, most of them are not going to just be persuaded by you suck, go away.
yeah,
Sorry. So, that's like the first thing is like, okay, there is a real, crisis here. There is something that's being spoken to here. So what do we do about it? And I think there's like sort of three different kind of lanes that I sort of go through. So like one is like, yes, I do think that, and this isn't like a particularly, I'm echoing other people here, but I'm going to take it in a slightly different direction, which is like, yes, the sort of standard, whatever you want to call it, woke, blah, blah, blah culture, it's not going to do the job. And, in terms of like answering the contradictions or the problems or the concerns that are raised by this subculture. And it's both not going to do the job in ways that speak well of it because, people don't want to be real about and confront some of the problems that the woke culture is at least diagnostically right about, things like racism. And they're also not going to work because, frankly, like they are, super moralistic and controlling, and they do tend to have really reactive, reductionist, repetitive takes. That, again, I do think most people out, and I think this is a lesson for all of us that it's so easy to be in micro subcultures right now that you really have to consider whether you're, a brocialist Joe Rogan head or a fucking SJW or a Bernie bro.
hmm
There's a lot of people that don't share your subcultural presuppositions. They
yeah,
do not. So I think so there's like there's a legitimate crisis. There's the failures of what is at least presented in the mainstream as a left answer to those crises. And so then what I do in the book is first I deal with after kind of setting up the bigger framework, I deal with the three main personalities, which is Peterson, Shapiro, and Harris. And,
Hmm.
obviously, I mean, look, so I'm trying to be less polemical and really deal with them in some ways. And, it's still my book. So, like, as an example, like, Dave Rubin's Dave Rubin.
Yeah.
That's a joke.
Yeah. That's a
And that
joke in
will be a
itself.
joke in the book, right?
Yeah.
Like, so, but, so I think that there's a fundamental difference, though. And I think, again, this is another reason why, to me, Sam Harris is absolutely somebody of the right because a lot of people with this like they have been trained in these like tick box view of politics, which is
Hmm.
like, oh well, other than these, it's almost like they've been trained in like the generation that could say like, oh, like Clinton is 95%, she voted with Bernie 95% of the time. It's like, oh, well, you mean, but the 5% was like the invasion of Iraq, the
Yeah.
Patriot Act, all of the main
Yeah. All the
generation
important
defining.
parts. Yeah.
Right. It's like,
Yeah.
okay, I'm glad that they agreed on, honoring a baseball player today
Yeah.
or calling something Willie Mays Day together, but that doesn't really tell us anything.
Yeah.
So the way Sam Harris is right wing, in my view, and the way and what they all share is that it's a fundamentally anti-historical enterprise.
Hmm.
Harris has this weird, he thinks that a combination of poll numbers and thought experiments can eliminate the need to historicize really major and issues that he runs into. He's got big opinions about over a billion people on the planet.
Yeah.
He's got big opinions about resurrecting the idea that some races are potentially, on average, genetically less intellectually capable.
Hmm.
Um, these are and my track again is it's not just like you're a bigot. If you asked me personally what my opinion was, I would say yes. I do think he is. But it's that you literally cannot understand these things without a serious historical anchoring.
Yeah.
The idea, like when you look at Afghanistan and you look at a real piece of reporting like Ghost Wars by Steve Cole, and you understand that in the 80s, even Afghan Mujahideen fighters did not want to do suicide operations. That was not in their context.
Mm.
You have to, all of a sudden, you're in a conversation where you have to understand what was the financial flow. Like,
Yeah.
it's not just because they go on this counteroffensive where it's like all you're saying is like ideology doesn't matter, it's just US foreign policy. The real answer is that every single thing matters.
Hmm.
But I think with a materialist viewpoint, ironically, me with the materialist viewpoint, even though I'm not this big, atheist, whatever, is that people's actual, literal material conditions and practices are the most sort of influential. So, anyways, and then with Peterson, there's his mythological thing, and then Ben Shapiro presents this. I mean, he's writing a history, but it's this, it's like Reader's Digest for 12-year-old whatever.
Yeah.
And so the argument is that we need to historicize all of these things and then re-anchor these conversations in people's real, actual conditions. And then
Hmm.
from that, the synthesis that I'm trying to create is like this idea of like a cosmopolitan socialism or a globalist socialism in the sense that, on one hand, we're not in this like woke space, and I'm following the lead of people like Kanan Malik, who's a really big influence on mine, who wrote this global history of ethics recently. And the way it sort of breaks down in a simple way is like if you talk about ancient Greece, which funnily enough I don't talk that much about because I'm not as educated on it as I should be, but I do know this that there's this Western chauvinist position that's like, hey, we go back to Greece and Greece to fucking America and fuck you and, the West, right? The
Yeah.
class chauvinist bigot position, which even if like the IDW and certainly Shapiro echoes, right?
Hmm.
Um, and then there's this like new, like, oh no, I don't want, those are dead white men, blah, 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 right? And then it's like, well, actually, what's funny is like a lot of these guys, and the Romans too, for that matter, were African. So you're not talking about dead white men. You're actually
Hmm.
already talking about a global culture. So that, and and a global culture trying to find global themes and echoing global experiences. So you aren't just bifurcating people into ever and ever greater separation. You're not drawing a false equivalency, but you are asserting that there does have to be common struggle.
Yeah.
And then on the other, but then of course conversely to these fucking chauvinists, I mean, all of the history that they want to negate, like the transition where Islam held the Greeks, and or the fact that the Greeks were African, literally shows you that this idea of like some uninterrupted chain is ahistorical in addition to being bigoted. So the
Yeah.
argument then is like, what we do need a solidarity rooted in our real material conditions. That is people call it the vulgar Marxist view, which usually, I'm sorry to say, just, it's called Marxism. Like, yes, there is a lot of that. But conversely, where you can't skip the quote unquote culture questions is that one, everything, of course, isn't just like misplaced economic anxiety. There are ideological lives for bigotry, and they exist in their own trajectory. And so my answer, instead of though retreating back to that kind of like the sort of shallow woke politics, which I'm rejecting, is but you have to build the corollary of that global solidarity is that it has to truly be like a genuinely global intellectual exercise. And I try to do that on my show, right? Like I really try to the extent that is humanly possible to, again, not discourse about something, but say like somebody like Cabral is a huge influence on how we need to think. And that's at the center. That's not like, like expand your horizons day. So that's sort of like, and then the last component of it that also sort of answers the book is like answers the IDW is that this is also, it's such a weird time to retreat into the stories that these guys are peddling in a time not only of huge economic anxiety in the West and changes in how people are living and experiencing the economy, which they're not speaking to, but then also the fact that like even on a just capitalist level, like, like Asia is actually rising. That isn't just like a kind of cliche. There is a global reorientation of power. So how are you even on like a pragmatic self-improvement level, if you want to take it there, really preparing yourself to like properly engage in today's world if you're, a kind of intellectual and cultural shut-in.
Yeah. And
So that's not what I'm dealing with.
there's a one point there I wanted to hit on just briefly. So you mentioned the shallow woke politics. That's something that someone like Jordan Peterson tries to hit on a lot. And I'm not sure if you saw the debate between Zizek and Peterson. I
Yeah, I
actually
did.
thought that Zizek did a good job trying to
He did a
almost
great job.
appeal to that side of that shallow woke politics, but then get them into a different perspective when it comes to capitalism. So yeah, I think you make some great points there, and I think it's important that we understand a lot of these people that follow, these sorts of figures, they're just uneducated, and if you get at them with something that they are familiar with, and you sort of, you kind of half agree with them on the shallow woke politics, like you agree with the parts of it that are legitimate, but then you get them in and you show them that, hey, actually, also on these other issues, here's a different perspective that you may not be aware of. But I think there is definitely a way to reach a lot of these people, because if they're uneducated, all we have to do is educate them, but do it in a way where we can actually grab them to begin with. And I think we can do that by exposing the shallow woke politics.
And then you also, I think, you make really clear where people are actually coming from, right? Because then
Hmm.
it's like, look, if you really are rooted in some type of prototypical white nationalism or something, then all right, you're the enemy.
Yeah,
On
exactly.
a political, like there's literally nothing complicated about that. And even there, like maybe that's dealt with like, I don't know how you convert people like that. I know sometimes people like that are converted. I know that some people put in like incredible work in doing that type of thing. So I'm not
Yeah.
even negating that. But on a political level, that is just like simple,
Yeah.
like I think that is the kind of room that, you need to be able to have. You need to be able to take on that people might have different cultural practices, they might have different ideas, they might have different experiences, they might even be rightly critiquing your subculture with how you perceive any number of these like hot button things.
Hmm.
But then if somebody is actually saying like, I don't want women in the workforce, or like I'm totally down with what they're doing in Alabama, then okay, like
Yeah, it's
good.
kind of hard to get somebody at that point. I mean, yeah.
But I think the right and that but I think the problem is that and it's funny to say this because like again, it's a dialectic. There's a lot of areas that we need to polarize way more on. But
Hmm.
there's other areas I think in a kind of cultural and digital space where people are definitely polarizing in ways that are just like both super feeble in terms of like thinking capacity and super off-putting to people. And again, I think that, part of this idea about reaching out, it's like it just isn't even a moral question. It's like it's like the morals are really simple. Do you like there's a rising social democratic party in Denmark, and part of the way the leader there, the part of the way she's doing it is she is seriously appealing to very harsh xenophobic attitudes. Well, for me, that's like, okay, that's the moral line.
Hmm.
Like, done,
Yeah.
right? So that's actually quite simple. But then on the other hand, like if you're going to go out and engage in the real world, like people are going to have like, there's going to be some hot take story of the week, and people are going to have different opinions on it. People are going to find different humor to be funny. Like
Hmm.
if you want to actually go out and deploy in some type of mass way, you need to fucking get over that and deal with it. And I am really tired of these people who I do think, have very, regressive and just totally insufficient. I mean, delusional agendas. These people are not going to help you chart a course for understanding your political, economic, social life. And I think, yeah, I think Zizek was a great example of that. And I know, but that's another, some people have all sorts of issues with Zizek,
Yeah, I know. Yeah.
right? And it's like so, and I don't, and again, that's fine. So disagree with Zizek, write your response. That's terrific. But I still want Zizek.
Yeah, there has to be
And
nuance there. I mean, you have to be able to
he just did
separate
a
certain
great
people.
job.
Yeah.
Yeah, and,
Yeah.
and and people need to get much more in the habit of that across the board. And I loved when Zizek, I mean, Zizek made that point that part of like why that certain attitude can be so off-putting and actually reinforce the same tendencies, that you're still centering yourself in that.
Yeah,
You're still
exactly.
centering, white centrality. It's
Yeah.
just the white centrality of like, oh no, I get it. That's the other part, right? Is like everybody's so freaked out about getting it, not making mistakes. Imagine if you had a culture where people actually could much more in a serious and honest way, um, actually self-reflect
Yeah.
and have like an openness where people can internally like actually better themselves
Yeah. Have the
without this
space to be able
constant, like,
to, yeah,
yeah, that's
exactly.
actually really important.
Yeah.
That's really important.
Yeah.
And so, yeah.
All right, I think that about does it. So where can people find you and your show?
Patreon.com/TMBS. You will get a lot of content. You'll get definitely, I would say, a very global political education. But we also it's a one of my ex-girlfriends said she said it. This is before I started my show, but she said it's like Al Jazeera meets Reckless. And I was like, that's actually pretty true. That's and then you can follow me on Twitter and Instagram, and also check out. I do a show with Waz, who's on TMBS a lot, called
Hmm.
Woke Bros on the Black Opinions Matter feed on iTunes, and I would check that out.
All right, check it out. Michael, thanks for coming on.
Oh, it's a pleasure. I really like watching your videos, man.
Oh, thank you. I love watching yours too.